Welcome back, life science learners. In this segment, we're going to look at the details of the male and female reproductive system. As I mentioned earlier on, when we're looking at reproductive organs, it's important in any context for us to understand structure, function, and then be able to explain the association of different parts. So that's exactly what we're going to do. So let's try and unpack what we've looked at in the first segment and now understand the details of each structure and their function. So we're going to focus again on the details of the male reproductive system, and we're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand how this actually works. So the male reproductive system contains the following structures that contribute to the production of sperm and semen, and they are important in the reproductive processes in males. The following structures that we're going to discuss are organized according to the path taken by sperm from the production to the release. So essentially what we're going to look at is where sperms are produced and their pathway all the way through the male reproductive system until they are released. Now, I think it's important so that we have an understanding to the journey of the sperm from where it's produced and even to the point at which when it is going to fertilize an egg. And that would be a continuation in terms of in the female reproductive system. So this gives you some direction as to where to start. So, as I mentioned, we will start with the point at which the male reproductive cells are produced. So we know that, as I mentioned earlier on, we have a pair of testes, and this diagram is a side view, and the reason I've chosen that is for us to be able to have a different context to how we see the male reproductive system. So on the side we've got a pair of testes, and as I mentioned, they're situated in a sac called the scrotum that distends or hangs slightly below the body. And they are connected to the rest of the male reproductive system through a coiled tube called the Epididymis. And so in this coiled tube, we find that the sperms spend some time actually maturing. They then travel up a tube called the Vas Deferens or the sperm duct. And that Vas Deferens is a tube that connects the testes to an area called the ejaculatory duct. And this is where the sperms are released into a tube called the urethra. So that is the tube that brings out the sperm along with the secretions from the glands during what we call an ejaculation. What is important also is for us to recognize that the urethra is a tube that also carries the urine, and that urine is stored in the bladder. And so we see that the bladder is there. Further up here we have the pair of kidneys that produce the urine, and you would have looked at that during the process of excretion, and then that urine is stored in the bladder. And we find that the urine and the semen are released through a common tube called the urethra. Not at the same time, but they are using a common tube to be able to release the production that these two different parts have. Okay, so we've looked at the tubes from the testes all the way up. As I mentioned earlier on, there are glands that are associated with the male reproductive system that contribute to the production of sperm and semen. So these glands, as I mentioned, was the prostate gland, the Cowper's gland, which I've called in this diagram the biliourethral gland, as well as we have the prostate gland. And so that prostate gland is situated right here. We also have a view of the proximity of the rectum and the anus, so it gives you an understanding as to where and how the body is situated. In the body, this is situated. We then look at the pubic bone, which is part of the pelvic girdle, and that's situated right in the front, and that's a section that we have through this pubic bone. Let's look at each part and try and understand, as I mentioned, its structure and its function. So when looking at the testes, we know that they are responsible for the production of sperm and an important hormone called testosterone. And testosterone is the male sex hormone that is produced that ensures that we have secondary sexual characteristics. And that's something that we're going to look at in terms of puberty and what is the impact of testosterone on the growth of a boy into a man. Okay, so in this diagram we can see here that's the testes, and they're situated in a sac slightly below the body in a sac called the scrotum. On closer view, we can take a section through the testes and we can look at that in detail. And this shows you a longitudinal section through the testes. And within that we see several coils of tubes called the seminiferous tubules. And it is within these tubules that we look at that we see the development of sperm taking place, or spermatogenesis. On the surface of the testes, as I mentioned, are the coil tubes, and you see that here, and that's the epididymis. And they connect to the vas deferens that then carries out the sperm to the ejaculatory duct. So again, in a longitudinal section, we can see that there are several tubes, highly coiled and convoluted, within the testes that produce the sperm cells. On closer inspection, I've taken this and I've cut a section through those tubes, and that is what I've illustrated here. So each of these tubes have been cut open, and that's what I've illustrated here. So we're looking at a cross section through each of these seminiferous tubules. And if we have a closer look at that, and that's one seminiferous tubule that's cut in a cross section, we can see that it contains several layers of cells, and these cells undergo a process of cell division, which we're going to discuss, called gametogenesis, to produce these young developing sperm cells. And if you look closer on here, we can see towards the middle we've got these cells developing. We also know that the seminiferous tubules play an important role in the production of sperm as well as the development of these sperm. Between the seminiferous tubules, if you look at this space here, we've got cells called interstitial cells, or your Leydig cells. And it is in these cells between the seminiferous tubules that we have testosterone being produced. So testosterone as a hormone is being produced in these cells here, and those cells will then release the testosterone that enter the seminiferous tubules and stimulate the further development of these sperm cells. Okay, and we see a closer view of these interstitial cells here. What is also important for us to recognize is that in the seminiferous tubules, there are cells that are playing a very important role in the maturation and the development of the sperms. And those cells are called the Sertoli cells. And those Sertoli cells are essentially the nursing cells that help mature and nourish the young developing sperms within the seminiferous tubules. And so if you look at this space here, we're seeing a cell that's responsible for the development and the maturation of sperm. As I mentioned, the coil tube on the surface of the testes here, called the epididymis, this is a site where the sperms mature. They develop the ability to become motile, which means that is where they mature and the tail develops so that they're able to swim and move through the vas deferens. Okay, so this is an important area where the sperms actually develop and are stored until ejaculation. What's also important to realize is that what happens if ejaculation does not happen, or what happens if sperms are not released? So those sperms have a lifespan after which they will gradually be degenerated and then used to sustain and to supply the nourishment for the other developing sperms. So sperms will eventually, upon maturation, remain in the epididymis and then be gradually broken down so that they can sustain and feed off other developing sperms. The vas deferens, or the sperm duct, is a long tube, and we see that here, that connects the epididymis to the point where the sperm is released. And so those long tubes conduct the sperm from the testes to the prostate gland, which connects to the urethra. And that is, there's an ejaculatory duct here, which allows for the sperm, along with the secretions from the accessory glands, to mix together to form semen. And that is where that process of ejaculation takes place. Okay, upon further looking into the male reproductive system, we know that there are glands that are associated with the male reproductive system. And we looked at these. These are your seminal vesicles, and here they are. We've got a pair of them. We also discussed the prostate gland, which is this gland situated slightly below the bladder. So let's look at the seminal vesicles. So these secrete a secretion that contains fructose. And if you think of fructose, it's a sugar It's a type of carbohydrate that's important, that provides the nourishment for these young developing sperms to be able to get the energy they need so that they can swim and travel. So that's there again to nourish them. The seminal vesicle also produces a secretion which is a mucus, and that mucus basically allows for the sperms to be able to survive the acidity as they pass through the urethra as well as up into the vagina. Remember that the urethra is a tube that releases urine as well. So this is very acidic, and hence many of the sperm cells are destroyed because of the hostile acidic environment. So having the secretions from these prostate glands as well as the seminal vesicles allow for the sperms to be able to survive more effectively. Okay. When we look at the prostate gland, this secretes an alkaline fluid, and this, as I mentioned, is important in neutralizing the vaginal acid, which obviously is what's going to destroy some of the sperm cells. So the prostate gland has a alkaline secretion. So think of the alkaline secretion and think of the acidic nature of the urethra firstly, as well as the vaginal tract. So these areas are highly acidic because of urine, and so we need to have some kind of alkaline medium to neutralize the acidity. And we know that acidity affects, or alkalinity can affect the survival of these sperms. So that is one mechanism that ensures that the sperm cells survive. Cool. We also mentioned the urethra, which is a tube that connects the bladder and carries out both semen and sperm. So this basically conducts sperm and semen from the prostate gland all the way to the rest of the body. Okay. Some important terms for us to be able to discuss. What is an erection? An erection basically is the hardening of the penis that occurs when the sponge-like tissue inside fills up with blood. Okay? Another important term is semen. And semen essentially is a mixture of sperm with the secretions from the prostate gland and the seminal vesicles. And these ensure that the sperm cells survive and are able to travel in that medium from the male reproductive system into the vaginal tract. Okay, so sperm, as we discussed, is a male reproductive cell, and that is produced during gametogenesis, and it's called a gamete. Okay? The release of semen along with sperm cells during copulation is called ejaculation. So when the male reproductive system releases semen, that process is called ejaculation. The following parts are in the female reproductive system. And so we're going to try and wrap this section up by looking at the female reproductive system. As I mentioned, these structures are also organized by the path in which the eggs travel from the point of production, which is from the ovaries all the way down to the cervix. So let's try and unpack that as we discuss these. So as I mentioned, the ovaries, we have a pair of them, and these are important in two things. They produce the eggs or the ova, as well as the production of estrogen and progesterone. And so these are the female reproductive hormones that are responsible for maintaining the female reproductive system, as well as changes in the body during puberty. We're also going to look at these structures called fimbriae, which are the ends of the fallopian tubes, which basically act as fingers that sweep and pull in the egg when they are released during ovulation from the ovary. These will then travel via what we call the oviducts or the fallopian tubes, which are extremely narrow tubes which have finger-like projections or hair-like cilia that allow them to sweep the egg along. And so that egg travels along until it gets into this muscular organ called the uterus. And the uterus is this muscular organ that has the lining called the endometrium. As I mentioned, the endometrium is the inner lining that is prepared in anticipation of an egg being fertilized. And finally, we have the female reproductive organ, which is used during copulation, and that is the vagina. So it's a muscular organ during sexual intercourse, during which the penis is inserted. And so we find that during sexual intercourse, the penis is inserted and semen is released, and that is able to travel up the cervix. Well guys, that's a wrap of this segment. You've been focused, you deserve a little break, so freshen up and I'll see you at the end of the break.